When we look at Judas, the upcoming game from Ken Levine, I think there are some conflicting thoughts that I have. So there was a series of interviews, like Jake Baldino and the rest of the Friends Per Second podcast. They went and got to see it. Jeff Keighley got to go see the studio and try the game and all that stuff. And they did some videos maybe like a month or two ago about it. We talked about those at the time. But what I found really telling about it is that this is supposedly a very new concept. The way Ken Levine has described it for over a decade at this point is that he wanted to make a game with narrative Lego. So his goal was to try and have a game where there are narrative components that players can assemble and put together in their own way to tell a unique story in a unique way. So everybody's experience will be a little bit different. Okay. Interesting. I've listened to the whole speech. He did like a whole, I think it was GDC thing about it, where he tried to explain it. And then in this like interview with Jeff Keighley and the FPS podcast, he tried to explain it. It still doesn't really make a lot of sense. It's basically like, yeah, so we have narrative components that can be swapped out. Maybe you put it together this way and somebody else puts it together this way. Okay, but what does that mean? Like, do you mean that we'll have a totally different story? Characters will choose different things. And then they're like, well, there's an example. So if you chose to side with this one of the three like main non-player characters, then when you go into this level, this guy's upset that you sided with them. So he shuts the door and blocks you out of getting through that level in that way. So you have to find a different way around that access door, which is something that only happened because you sided with that guy. And I'm like, okay, that sounds interesting. But like, how is that any different than any other game where there's like, okay, you made this decision. Like, how is it different from an RPG where you just sided with this guy, so this consequence happens and then you go this way? It's not really clear. And I think it's because he's trying to do something novel and something different, but it just sounds like a RPG to me, or like a game with branching narratives, like something like Detroit Become Human, where the level of depth with decisions and consequences are absolutely crazy, you know? And so it sounds interesting, but as he's explaining it, it's all just very vague and broadly fairly confusing, frankly. And here's the deal. I talk all the time about the importance of like skepticism in life, not just within the world of video games, but also just in general. And all skepticism is that you just withhold acceptance of a claim until there's sufficient evidence to accept that claim. So for Ken Levine pitching a video game, you know, the claim is often that you should pre-order this game or you should get hyped for this game, whatever. My stance is that, we look at all the pieces of evidence and then we evaluate that together. And that's how we reach our conclusion of whether this game looks really good, whether this game deserves hype to whatever extent it could, all of that stuff. Ken Levine working on it is both a positive and a negative. On the positive side, it's because he's worked on things like Bioshock and System Shock. Like, he really knows what he's doing. But also, he's kind of made the same game for 25 years. They're very, very good games, but they all kind of follow the same formula. And that's why everybody who played this game was like, yeah, it's basically Bioshock in space. I mean, that's basically what it is. That's why it looks so similar. Same thing with like the sort of weird magic tech abilities with one hand and the gun in the other. It's the same basic thing. So he knows what he's doing making those types of games. On the flip side, he also has a history of over-promising, of being a perfectionist, trying to do a lot of stuff that doesn't end up actually happening. Famously, there's that Krabby Cat video on the Bioshock Infinite. Yeah, this video. And when you hear him talk about the game, Bioshock Infinite, at the time of this interview, it doesn't even sound like the same game, because it frankly wasn't.
The city of Columbia was originally built as by the United States government in the 1890s as a sort of a floating World's Fair, something they could float from one corner of the earth to the other and demonstrate to the rest of the world the success of the American experiment.
And that's all still there. That's all true.
Keep looking, Lincoln.
And what happened was there was a power struggle within Columbia. And this fellow who you'll sort of start to get a sense of in this demo, named Comstock, came into power in the city. And he had a bit of a different view. He had a more, extreme view of what the mission of America and the world is. And there were some people in the city who didn't like that. And that group was Vox Populi. it started as a sort of a resistance, almost like a student movement against, the founders, the founders group that Comstock led, as, working to help, to unionize workers, to protect the rights of minorities, things like that within the city. But as the conflict between the founders and the Vox Populi got more extreme, each side started sort of ramping up their actions.
Hey, little girl. Yeah.
You're going. Come on.
So there's a lot of things they wanted to do with the game that they ended up cutting and shifting. What we ended up getting was very good. I mean, don't get me wrong. I love Bioshock Infinite. I think towards the end of the game, it gets needlessly overcomplicated. The game's over a decade long, so I can just say there's all sorts of weird, like, multi-dimension, time travel, alternative reality universe thing. It gets to the point where it's like, yes, it's very confusing. You don't understand it? That's all by design. And it's like, the problem is there's probably a term for this in writing, but there's a feeling that I have with a lot of stories, and like, it happens in novels, it happens in films, TV shows, games, everywhere. But there's a thing that happens where writers will just try to confuse you. And when you're confused, they're like, yeah, that's because it's deep. And it's like, no, it's not deep. It just doesn't make sense. It's like, if you can't, what's the old saying? It's like, if you can't dazzle them with your brilliance, baffle them with your bullshit. And I think that it's the same kind of thing. Yeah, people are saying like with Kojima writing. Yeah, where it's like, I think if a writer puts a story together that the audience overwhelmingly can't understand, that's a failure of the writer. You could say the story's just so deep, you just can't comprehend it. Okay, but if I can't tell the difference between a story that doesn't make sense and is nonsense and a story that's so deep and brilliant that I just can't comprehend it, they're effectively the same thing because my perception of them are identical. The outcome is going to be identical regardless. So with some of these stories where it's just like, yeah, it's time travel, multi-warp things, and then this plot twist happened, doesn't make any sense. It's like Lost, the TV show, where it's just they kept doing all of these weird things, and like, yeah, there's a smoke monster, and then also there's weird Egyptian hieroglyphics everywhere, but also it's purgatory, but it's not, even though they're in a Catholic church with Buddhist statues everywhere. Like, none of it makes any sense at all. But they're like, yeah, but that's all part of it. It's like, no, you just wrote a bad story and I have no idea what's going on. At some point, the writer is responsible for putting a story together that makes some semblance of sense. So that was my frustration with Bioshock Infinite, despite everything else I really loved about it. It was a story or a game whose story I liked less the more I played, because it just got to the point where I felt like I was playing 2 or 3 different games at the same time, because I probably was. It probably did change a lot during development. And so you just end up with little strands of a bunch of different games scattered all over the place. So with that having been said, I think Ken Levine is very, very good at what he does, but just because he's really good at that does not mean that there aren't growing pains with it. And in terms of his style of work, it's been reported plenty that he's a tougher person to work with because he is a perfectionist. He knows what he wants, and he is sort of the god emperor of his domain. So if he comes into the studio one day and he's like, yep, we're cutting all of Act 4 and we're going to redo it, that's what you're doing. There's no oversight. It's a similar problem that can happen with like any studio or any team that's headed up by one strong personality, whether it's a Todd Howard or a Kojima, or even a Hidetaka Miyazaki or somebody at FromSoft. If there's one guy that makes all the final decisions, you're prone to this type of thing happening. You can end up with amazing games, but it also means that sometimes you are just following the instructions of the local dictator. The dictator might be very good at what they do and might know what they're doing. When they tell you what to do, it doesn't mean that it's easy to work with them or easy to hire them to develop some sort of project. And I think that's where 2K was with Bioshock. So after this, Ken Levine was like, I don't want to do another Bioshock. I want to do something else. So he made his own studio, and they closed down the studio that made Bioshock. And then they reopened another studio with the same basic team. It's kind of a mess, but basically the team that made Bioshock was no more. They made another team that's doing Bioshock now. Ken Levine went over, got another team built up with most of the like Infinite devs is my understanding. And he's been working on this. And it's funny that he didn't want to make another Bioshock game because he basically did. But now he's been working on this. This is going to see the light of day at some point, probably next year sometime. And the next Bioshock will come whenever. So if anything, I'm excited to see what this next Bioshock game is, because it has like veterans from the original games in positions of leadership within the game's development. But it doesn't have one of the potential downsides, which is the the team having to follow the machinations of Ken Levine, who is a very talented dev, no doubt about it, but he's also a tougher guy to work with, I feel. And like this stuff is really cool. That's a cool concept for like a dentist chair that attacks you. That's super cool. Yeah, but no, he's not tied to the world of Bioshock. Yeah, it's a different franchise, but in terms of gameplay, in terms of all of that stuff, it seems to be very, very, even in terms of setting, it seems to be very, very shockingly similar to Bioshock. I've heard rumors of a Bioshock TV show. I think that would do well, honestly. They might just be waiting to do that until there's like until there's something more. But they've also phrased this. So he described how the ship that you're on changes its arrangement based on what you're doing. And presumably this is how you navigate the ship, through load screens. So it's not clear if you're able to just run freely through the ship, or if you have to take this guy and he will take you through with load screens between areas of the ship. But they specifically have not wanted to mention how traversal works through the ship. And when they were doing the interviews after the journalists got to play it, they very intentionally did not want to talk about this, which was interesting. It's very interesting. Wait, you can have a puppy car? Yeah. Netflix is working on a Bioshock TV show. They started production a year ago, so it's going to be for a while. Yeah, I mean, that's awesome to hear. And I mean, if they time it out right and they do Bioshock 4 around the same time the show drops, easy peasy, lemon squeezy. It's probably what they're trying to time it for. All artists and directors are tough, really. They have a vision and wants everyone to see what they see. Oh, no doubt, Katie Cat. I think that there's an art form, certainly, and there's a skill set to being the visionary artist and then being able to communicate and lead a team of other artists to continue that on. I even saw this when I was like playing chess super hardcore back in high school, when I was going around to tournaments, going to nationals and stuff. There were amazingly gifted players who were just savants. I mean, they were geniuses and just understood the game, but they could not teach people. Like, they could not explain their understanding of the game or what they were doing. They could not communicate their expertise, but they were experts. They just didn't know how to communicate. It's the difference between being like an expert and being a teacher. Like, you can be a really good teacher of a subject, but maybe not the best in the world at that subject, but you are amazing at helping people understand that subject. It's very, very different. And we've all had this where, like, in college, I had what class did he teach? I think it was our stock analysis class. So he was teaching like how do you like value stocks, how do you value options and things like that. And his name was Mr. Meow, Professor Meow. He's a very funny guy. He would always just be like, "I'm Professor Meow," like kitty cat. But he spoke very, 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 very broken English. One of the sweetest guys ever. But he really struggled with communicating his deep understanding of these topics to the rest of the group. And, you know, in that case, I think it was specifically a language barrier issue. But it's just one thing. You can be really good at what you do, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be good at doing something broadly for everybody else, you know? Like, it's different. It's different. It's different to run a team. I think Judas could be really good. I think Bioshock 4 could be really, really good. My fear with Judas is just the more that they've tried to explain it, the less sense it seems to make. It just sounds like, so you're doing stuff that narrative branching games have done for a long time, with like branching decisions and consequences based on actions. That's all great. But then they insist on not just saying that. They insist on calling it narrative Lego. And I'm like, I'm getting vibes of Hideo Kojima saying that, you know, Death Stranding's a new genre. It's a totally new thing. When in reality, it's just a UPS simulator. You know, it's like, it's not really that new. It's still can be fun. It can be fine. But like, let's not pretend that this is something totally novel and new. Like, I'm not just gonna help you self-flagellate, okay? Like, we're gonna not flagellate. Well, is it flagellate? Okay, I'm not gonna participate in the verbal masturbation. Let's just do that, okay? I'm like, we're not gonna do that. What do you mean? Death Stranding is a FedEx simulator, not UPS. Yeah, well, I guess it depends on how good you are, because when you're really good at deliveries, it's more of a FedEx simulator. When you're really bad and all of the packages get damaged, it's more of a UPS simulator. Let's be honest. Have you seen those videos of the UPS guys just chucking the boxes like from the street off to the patio, not realizing there's a camera watching them? Oh, USPS, that's when you fail a delivery, yeah. He took my thing.